This is a 1992 Nissan 240SX. In fact, it's my 240. This is a vehicle I have always dreamed of having. It may not be much and look like a Japanese rice burner, but it's my Japanese rice burner. And today I'm gonna show you around it a little bit, walk you through why I bought it, and give it a little review. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my all-new enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era. Now with free listings, you can list your cool car free and auction it live on Cars and Bids. And you should, because we've had some great sales recently, including this 2021 Volkswagen Golf GTI, which sold for about $30,000. This fantastic 1995 Ford F-150 brought $2,000, and this 2014 Dodge Challenger 100th Anniversary Edition, which sold for just over $69,000, which is a great deal for one of these. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and a great selection at carsandbids.com. So let's talk 240. My 240. Now first, some basic. This is an S13 240SX that was sold in North America from 1989 until 1994. It came from the factory with a 2.4 liter inline 4-cylinder that made about 155 horsepower. And today I'm going to show you around my 240. First, I'll talk about why I bought it and how I plan to use it, and then I'll show you a few of its quirks and features, and then I'll take it on a test drive and give it a Doug score. Alright, time to talk about my new, not really, 240. Now I'm going to start with an explanation of what exactly I plan to do with this vehicle. Because if you know me, you know that I don't have my license, or even my permit. So what exactly do I need this thing for? Here's the deal. I wanted to buy a 240 since I was like 11 years old, and I have been saving up to buy one ever since. And finally, in December of 2021, I bought one. This one. I then had the car trailered to my house from New York, where it sat in the garage for the next few months. But recently, I have started to drive the thing. And no, I still do not have my permit. I get that in like 3 months. And if you were wondering, yeah, I drove it here. But there was more that went into my decision than just me liking it. The 240 is known for its near perfect 55 to 45 weight distribution, making it quite a tossable car. Additionally, that makes it a better drift car, especially to start out. And these cars have plenty of aftermarket support. The engine was another big factor to me. And yes, it has been engine swapped, which I will talk about more in a few minutes. I will probably end up using this car as my primary source of transportation for the first few months of having my permit. Then after that, once I realize it's a piece of crap, I will then buy a diesel truck that has like 12 miles to the gallon. But we don't talk about that. But until then, I am stuck with this 230,000 mile 1990s Nissan. Now 240 enthusiasts are going to be watching this video and saying, well, why not buy a nice, new, clean one, bone stock, and build it from the ground up? And the simple truth is, I don't know how to do that. And yes, I would learn, but I don't have the money for that, and I'm still learning anyway. For example, in April, my fuel pump just randomly stopped working, and I had to fix a wire that gotten shorted. Not a huge deal, but I learned how to diagnose it. Then my car decided to start leaking fuel, and I had to diagnose that, which turned out to be a clamp that I needed to replace. The other reason I didn't buy a bone stock one is that they're overpriced, and I don't have money to do a full build on one of these things. The engines are $6,000, which is half the price of what I paid for the car. But overall, this car is the perfect car for me, and I think it's a great starting place. Another question people might have is, why not get something nicer? I could spend the same amount of money on other newer and nicer cars like an drift-ready E36 M3, yet I chose not to. Well, like I said earlier, I've always wanted one of these since I was about 11, and this one came up and I couldn't help myself. So with all that explanation out of the way, let's talk about the quirks and features. Like I said, 1992 model with about 230,000 miles. The 240 was built on the world famous S chassis. The S chassis mainly consists of the S13, S14, and S15 model, mine being an S13. The S13 240s were offered in 3 different body styles, a coupe, a hatchback, and a convertible. Mine is a hatch, which is the best one. They also went through 2 different facelifts for the S13. The first one went from 1989 until 1990, and it was the pig nose front bumper. The next one was 1991 through 1994, which was the shark nose front bumper. Personally, I like the pig nose way better than the shark nose, although mine was a shark nose car. But now mine has neither. Instead, my car actually has a Type X bumper. It has a whole Type X kit off of a Japanese 180 SX. It has the front bumper, side skirts, and these rear things. that I'm not really sure what to call them. It doesn't have the Type X wing though. Instead it has this cool veil side wing, which personally I think looks a little nicer. Now unfortunately, I bought this car at the worst possible time to buy a car, but especially the worst time to buy an old 240. Now the market has changed quite a bit in the past few years for these cars. I remember like 3 years ago, I found one on Facebook Marketplace for like $3,500 and I was like, I'll wait a little bit, I don't have that money. Well, I paid $12,000 for this one, even though it has double the mileage and a lot of rust. But anyway, next up, let's talk engine in the 240. Like I said, from the factory, these cars came with a 2.4 liter naturally aspirated inline 4-cylinder that made about 155 horsepower. But in this car, on the other hand, it came with the S13 DET, which means it is a 2-liter 4-cylinder with a Garrett T28 turbo. There were 3 iterations of the SR20: the red top, the black top, and the notch top. My car has a notch top, which came out of a Japanese S14, as the SR20 never came in the American version. The notch top added some variable valve timing components, allowing the engine to provide more smooth acceleration throughout the RPMs. Apparently, my engine has about 35,000 miles and makes about 275 horsepower. All of that power is then made into a 5-speed manual transmission. Now let's talk styling of this car. The S13 240SX looks like a lot of other 80s and 90s Nissan sports cars. It was on sale up against other icons like the R32 GTR and the Z31 300ZX. But because the 240 is better than those vehicles, this car has pop-up headlights. In other markets, there was a different front end offered on Silvia models called the SIL 80 front end, which ditched the pop-up headlights in favor for a brick-style light. The 240 is also incredibly small, measuring at 178 inches from front to back. Next up, I want to talk naming for this car. Now in North America, this was marketed as the 240SX, given it had a 2.4 liter engine. Now in Europe and Australia, it was sold as the 200SX, but in Japan, it was sold as the 180SX, even though they both offered a 1.8 liter and a 2 liter engine. This makes it pretty confusing for anyone, unless of course you're watching this video. But anyway, let's go through some of the quirks and features on the interior. But there aren't many really, because 75% of it is missing. Up here we have a dashboard, 2 climate vents, this thing that I never zip tied back into place, and a hole. There's also factory climate controls in this car, which is cool because it isn't a dial, it's a slider, and it's oddly satisfying to play with. Looking at the gauge cluster, you will notice not 1, but 2 screens, which are there to give you important readouts as you're driving along. You also notice that the odometer says 212,000 miles, but who knows how much is actually on it because the sticker says 227,000. You also notice I have a working fuel gauge, which is a nice upgrade compared to most 240 models. Looking around, you will also notice this absolutely hideous shift knob. It's this blue ball with stars in it that just looks cheap, and honestly I'm gonna get a new one. I also had to replace this center console lid because it has a hole in it. Probably it's supposed to be a cup holder, but when it shakes this much, it's not really operational. One benefit to this specific 240 is that it comes with a Corvo FX1 seat, and it is quite bolstered and sturdy. You also notice there are racing harnesses on both the driver and passenger sides, making it feel like a true performance car. Some other performance touches in this interior are this cool steering wheel and this bar that goes from one side of the car to the other, providing extra chassis strength. Moving on to the back of the car, where you will notice it's a hatchback. And once you open it, you'll notice that the car is completely gutted. The only thing left back here is one interior panel and this bench that was left from the seat, which is the perfect place to lie down and take a nap on a long road trip. There's also holes in the floor, not only from where there used to be a spare tire, but also where rust has eaten away at the floor. It's also where you will access the fuel release. Unfortunately, my dad broke it in the first day of me owning it, and now it just kind of flops around. I would also like to point out the taillights on this car, which are Type X taillights to go along with the Type X body kit. And they look a little bit different than the ones found on stock 240s. I installed these a couple months ago, and I think it's a major upgrade to the back of the car. Finally, you will notice the exhaust back here, which has one fat tip with a dent at the top, and it sounds pretty good. Take a listen. And so, those are the quirks and features of my 1992 Nissan 240SX. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. Alright, driving the 240. Alright, so this car, really fun to drive. It's really loud in here, obviously. And, yeah. Anyway, so, there's no back to this car. So it's a very raw experience. And I have no place to put the camera, so I kind of did my best there. you go. That's my 1992 Nissan 240SX. I know it's not all that cool, but it's a very special car to me. I have always wanted one of these, and I am thrilled to say that I own this one. And now it's time to give my 240 a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the 240 is a pretty tame design. No major risks were taken, but it has pop-up headlights, so it gets a 7 out of 10. Acceleration is pretty quick, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Handling is above average, as you need to control the car on the racetrack, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Fun factor is very high, as it is fun to drive, and it puts a smile on my face, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Cool factor is really high, as you don't see too many of these, and they're really hot right now, so it gets a 9 out of 10, for a total weekend score of 38 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The 240 isn't really well equipped, unless you count a working fuel gauge and some cool screens, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is surprisingly good, as the Corbo seat is pretty comfortable, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Quality is fine, but is missing a few interior bits and isn't put together all that great, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Practicality is surprisingly high, given its a hatchback shape, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value, and these are pretty big money for what they are, but they aren't getting any cheaper, and it gets a 7 out of 10, bringing the total daily score to 20 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 58 out of 100, which places it here against some other comparable cars. The 240 is a pretty good performance car, but it loses a lot of possible points in the daily category. I guess that means I will have to buy a Ford F-350 after all.